I am here today to answer a simple question. What the hell is going on at HBO Max right now? If you're a fan of Westworld, Infinity Train, or like any other property associated with this streaming service, you're likely either mourning the loss of a show that has no other digital or physical record anywhere, or you're waiting to see if your favorite series is the next up to get the chop. This is some pretty uncharted water in terms of the streaming world, but the general sentiment in the air right now is that it's not supposed to work like this. And if you're familiar at all with this story, you're probably looking for a reason as to why. But if it was a cut and dry timeline of events that led to all of your favorite media getting put at risk of being sent to the void so some faceless CEO can accrue a tax write-off, I wouldn't have much to talk about. So today I am going to put my master's degree in media management to good use and break down exactly, and I mean exactly, how it is we got to this point. Some quick housekeeping though, follow me on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe if you haven't, it helps me out and helps out the channel significantly, thanks so much. Part 1. What the fuck is HBO? HBO has a long, storied, and frankly confusing history. The company was founded in 1972, with the unabbreviated title being Home Box Office. The premise started out simple. Subscribers would pay a monthly fee along with their cable channel, and in return they would get uncut commercial movies and eventually original programming. HBO became very successful with that original programming endeavor and became synonymous with prestige TV like The Sopranos, The Wire, and eventually Game of Thrones. Throughout HBO's growth as a company, it basically started applying this basic model to a bunch of channels, so that's where things like HBO 2, Cinemax, and HBO Family come in. You pay extra money for channel gives you movies and shows. In 2010, HBO, way ahead of the streaming bubble, also released HBO Go, where you could get access to HBO content to stream online, but you had to have a cable subscription to the service as well. HBO Now was the company's first real attempt at a streaming service similar to that of Netflix or Hulu. The platform was targeted specifically at cord cutters. And for a while it got really confusing because nobody knew the difference between HBO Go and HBO Now, and then finally in 2020, HBO Max was launched into the streaming service we know it to be today. You got your classic HBO properties, you got your HBO Max originals, and you have other properties on there that are associated with other brands and companies, like Warner Brothers. So now that you understand HBO, let's talk about who owns it, which is also, you guessed it, really complicated. Before this evil empire was called Warner Brothers Discovery, it was called Warner Media, and before that, it was called Time Warner. Time Warner became a thing before most of us were born in the year 1990. It was the result of a merger between Time, which owned HBO, Time Magazine, and a few other things, and Warner Communications, which owns Warner Brothers Pictures. By 2018, through various media merging and consolidation efforts from all parties involved, Time Warner had three main arms that we need to worry about: HBO, Warner Brothers Pictures, and Turner Broadcasting. The consolidation of all those things means that all of these brands that you see on the screen are owned by one company, which means that the business decisions at CNN, Warner Brothers, and Adult Swim now by proxy affect the decisions being made at HBO. This has also been further complicated by the fact that all of these separate decisions have had no clear overarching leadership due to who has been at the helm of the parent company over these years. In 2018, US cell phone carrier AT&T made the decision to acquire Time Warner, formally renaming it as Warner Media. This presented a whole bunch of complications though, because AT&T got into hot water with the US government over antitrust laws. I explained this back in my video on Ticketmaster, but back in the day the government used to be significantly better about enforcing these laws so that these massive mega corporations wouldn't have too much unchecked power or possess the ability to stifle competition. However, due to a litany of reasons I can't get into for time, that mindset has since fallen by the wayside. But because AT&T was busy being marred in a legal battle basically the entire way through their acquisition of Time Warner, there was no one to really take the reins on this massive ship headed directly for an iceberg. Put a pin in this for now, we'll come back to it in a second. Due to a series of not-so-great business decisions, AT&T decided that they did not want to play with their new toy anymore, so they sold off Warner Media to Discovery less than 4 years later, and that's who owns this dumpster fire now for a fraction valuation of what AT&T had actually bought it for. So before we get into present day, we have to talk about some of those business decisions that led to the company being in this much of a vulnerable position. Part 3, into the Snyderverse. So because of all of the media merging nonsense that I explained up top, Warner Brothers eventually came into possession of the DC Universe characters, similarly to how most of Marvel's characters are owned by the Walt Disney Company. Basically, Warner Brothers took notice of how Marvel was really popping off with their cinematic universe and how the hype was really building up for Avengers, and decided they wanted to do the same thing, but with their own properties, presumably with the intent of leading to a Justice League team-up movie. However, they sort of just rushed the whole planning process that Marvel had been multiple years into with a forgotten portion of trial and error. Man of Steel was the first entry into the DC cinematic universe. It was the first solo Superman movie in quite some time, and it was directed by Zack Snyder. Snyder is not my favorite director. I'm not gonna go too hard on him, he's gone through a lot in the past couple of years, but in my own humble opinion, he has fundamentally misunderstood the whole point of Watchmen, which was his first foray into the superhero world back in like 2009, and he's really hyper-stylized, and if your goal is to make a competitor to Marvel, which I'm not saying is objectively right or wrong, but regardless, it's not the kind of move that screams big, dumb, loud commercial success. So Man of Steel comes and goes in 2013, whatever, people are generally receptive to it, although it clearly takes itself more seriously than the typical Marvel formula, which again, not necessarily a bad thing. And then Batman v Superman happens a few years later, and it really manages to do neither character justice, no pun intended. There are plenty of video essays out there on this, you don't need my take, but as a lifelong Batman fan, this movie didn't really do it for me, and it wasn't well received by a ton of people, which is crazy considering it's a movie with both fucking Batman and Superman. This movie was the beginning of the end of the short-lived DCEU in the sense that it pissed off fans of the comic book characters, and it pissed off Zack Snyder fans who liked this interpretation but felt, I don't know, oppressed when Warner Brothers decided to go in a different direction after its release. That different direction resulted in the equally as rushed Justice League, which was tonally different from the first two in-universe movies and was an embarrassing commercial flop that did not turn a profit.
In case you forgot, the guy who they brought in to fix or finish Justice League after Zack Snyder had to step away because of a family tragedy was Joss Whedon. Like, they brought in the Marvel guy to finish, like, what was supposed to be DC's, like, magnum opus and was supposed to be, again, like, their big hit and their big success. They bring in Joss Whedon, who has plenty of issues on his own and is problematic in his own way. They bring him in. He tries to inject that Marvel humor and his sort of tone and Avengers style into the Justice League, and it just didn't work. I hated it when it came out. I literally left the theater fuming. And that was when I gave up on the DC universe, and I knew that, like, it was always going to be inferior to Marvel as long as they held on to the Zack Snyderverse. And I liked a few of the projects. I thought Peacemaker was great, by the way. Not that it was kind of its own thing, the Suicide Squad. Oh, what? Hey.
Brian.
Yeah.
What the fuck are you doing right now?
I just wanted to add the whole Joss Whedon bit, because, like, that's so funny to me.
Are you making a cameo in my video right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, you didn't have that part in the script, and I just wanted to sort of help you out,
Brian,
you know?
I'm recording a video right now.
No, I know, I get that. I'm sorry, I just...
Brian!
What?
What the fuck is wrong with you? The movie was so bad that fans of Zack Snyder, who directed the film, petitioned for the studio to release his extended cut of the movie, which for some reason they agreed to do. So now fans who love Zack Snyder are mad, fans who hate Zack Snyder don't really give a shit anymore, and the studio continues to shit out a mix of films that supposedly take place in this universe that range from mid to bad. But there's also an alternate universe version of content that features these characters in production, and some of those are actually pretty good, like Matt Reeves' The Batman and James Gunn's reimagining of the Suicide Squad. And while this is going on, there are rumors that the studio is just going to have a literal do-over, and a film that features their in-universe Flash character runs so far back in time that it creates an alternate timeline, I think. And then that plan gets scrapped because Ezra Miller decided to go on an improbable crime spree across the United States. It doesn't matter what you think of all of this insanity. It's literally what lost Warner Media a majority of their good standing and capital, and it's why Discovery is now burning the Library of Alexandria to slash their debts. But this somehow isn't the only catastrophic failure we have to talk about in terms of Warner Brothers' long troubled history. We actually have two more to get through. Another one of Warner Brothers' most valuable properties is the Harry Potter franchise. Before the days of multiverses and cinematic 5-year plans, this was probably like the most important asset in all of media. All of the films did well commercially and critically, they're well regarded and hold a very sentimental place in the hearts and minds of fans all over the world, and unfortunately for WB, their last official film in the series was in 2011. But surely there are plenty of avenues for you to explore the Harry Potter universe with the sequels and spin-offs. Maybe, do the thing that literally everyone wants. Or we can make an entire franchise written by notorious TERF scumbag J.K. Rowling, who has no actual screenwriting experience, and we're gonna base it off a character in a fictional wizarding textbook. Genius. I'll be real, I never actually saw Fantastic Beasts, but I don't need to. I know it's bad. And I also know that it was fraught with tons of scandals, mainly J.K. Rowling being exposed as an idiotic transphobe who created bad blood with the original cast and was literally name-dropped by Vladimir Putin, Johnny Depp, who was cast as the series villain, was removed from the project due to an ongoing controversial court battle with Amber Heard, who was also involved in the DCEU, and Ezra Miller, who also starred in this series, is still out doing an aforementioned string of crimes. All of this, plus the movies themselves being bad, resulted in yet another critical and commercial flop, racking up even more debt on Warner Media's doomsday clock. And finally, let's talk about CNN+. Now, this is my wheelhouse, so excuse me if I geek out for a moment, but basically when streaming started taking over the whole world, news had to figure out their place in the world outside of traditional cable and broadcast transmission. Some companies got this more correct than others did, and CNN decided to build an independent streaming service that would act as an extra add-on for fans of the network. One problem though, nobody wants to pay for news. And on top of that, CNN Plus wasn't even really offering news. They were offering special and documentary programming, some of which was pretty high quality, some that definitely wasn't, but you were essentially paying for extra stuff and not CNN itself. This model fundamentally misunderstands so much about the traditional news audience, it's absurd, because if you're consuming news outside of just scrolling through headlines on Twitter, chances are you needed to be both free and convenient, two things that CNN Plus was not. And they poured millions and millions of dollars into this thing. I personally know very talented people who abandoned ship in pretty secure roles to come work for CNN Plus, only for them to barely survive a few weeks after launching. The failure of CNN Plus was actually the first early indicator of how new management was going to start handling things at Warner Media, because the launch coincided with the incoming regime change of Discovery. Months of hard work was scrapped, the service was terminated, and everyone was fired, with the company having to pay out pretty hefty severances or relocate everyone they spent so much time bringing in. This, while in some form or fashion might have been necessary, was no doubt harsh and unforgiving, but let's be honest, nobody was really riding or dying for CNN at this point, so it didn't make too many waves unless you're super tuned into the journalism world. And CNN is having its own range of issues, and if anyone wants to hear me rant about them at some point, let me know. And then enter David Zaslav. Zaslav is the new president and CEO of Warner Bros. Discovery. He basically made his empire running the Discovery Network, which owns TLC, Shark Week, all of that stuff. Zaslav comes from the world of, well, cheaply made reality TV projects, so his goal coming into the Warner Brothers mess was to get their massive debt under control while also trying to turn a profit. Now here's where things get complicated. Out of all of the failures of Warner Brothers that I had previously just mentioned, the one thing that they managed to get right, despite all of the odds stacked against them, was HBO Max. In the age of everyone having a streaming service, they managed to rise above with the superior programming and an expansive library of HBO content that dated back pretty far. It was the one service that people, no matter who you asked, really didn't mind paying for. So you'd think that the goldmine here would be to just allow HBO to produce this content and people would continue to pay for it, and hopefully restructuring everything else along the way would give you a better footing than what you were previously on. But that's not what happened. The biggest bombshell to come out of the start of this whole thing was the cancellation of Batgirl, starring Leslie Grace, Michael Keaton, and Brendan Fraser. The film was only going to be released on streaming, and it was already filmed and through a pretty significant chunk of post-production, and it was scrapped, making it one of the most expensive canceled releases ever. Zaslav basically gave the explanation that he believes that Warner Brothers has been misusing its superhero properties, so much so that he found it a waste to release a movie that didn't align with their new DC Universe vision. Is he right about DC's approach to the use of their characters? Sure, but to scrap a movie like this was pretty unheard of, and unfortunately, he didn't stop there. Here's a list of the titles that have been removed from HBO Max since that merger in April. There's a couple of different reasons for this, but here's a quote from Vulture that sums it up pretty well. Long story short, there are legal rules and regulations allowing a company like WBD to write down costs incurred as part of a post-merger restructuring, but only for a short amount of time. Taking shows such as Minx or Westworld out of the HBO Max and, more importantly, the WBD library will apparently help the mega corporation make its future balance sheets look a lot better. This isn't just about saving a few $1,000s on residual checks or licensing costs, it's about writing down millions in amortization costs these titles would have incurred in coming years. A vanished show here, a vanished show there, and pretty soon you're talking about a meaningful impact on WBD's overall earnings report, or so the company hopes. So unfortunately, yeah, it's all coming down to money again, folks, but here's the problem. With the digital streaming age came a lot of promises, mainly that these beloved media properties would always be available to you at your convenience, instead of making a random one-off appearance on a cable channel at an indiscriminate time, or being available in only physical form. However, as always, the people who really get burned here are the creatives as well as the viewers who consume their work. Writers, animators, and producers all pour months and months of hard work into one season of a show, and to have it be pulled into a black hole without warning and no recourse is just like a weird type of cruel, you know? And in the age of fascination with lost media, the concept of it has never been so driven. These works don't have to be lost, it's just that big business is quite literally getting in the way of their own preservation. And you could argue that Zaslav is just doing what needs to be done to get Warner Brothers back on track, but it's coming at a really, really heavy cost. And it's also coming at the expense of trust in their viewers. Like, I know they're just one Sex Lives of College Girls cancellation away from losing subscribers for good. So do I think they'll course correct? Maybe, I don't know. But I guess my biggest takeaway is to support good art while it's still here, because it may not be that way for very long.